What's up guys, and welcome to another video. This is the Legend of Zelda timeline, including every single installment in the entire series, and I bet you there's going to be at least one installment that you haven't heard of included in here. But before we get into the whole timeline, there is a few things I want to mention. First off, I'm not trying to take credit for all of the ideas or theories that I have in this timeline. I used some other people's timelines and based this off of them. I did add some of my theories in certain places, but I'm also not claiming that this is true, that this is the exact chronology of the expanded Zelda timeline. So if there is anything that you disagree with, make sure to let me know in the comments down below and I can check that out, because I do constantly update the timelines and you can see those updates on my website linked in the description. And also, if there is something that you don't understand about the timeline, like any elements that you don't understand, you can check out that website in the description, and there should be a button that says explanation of timeline elements, and that will show you what all of the elements of the timeline mean. And finally, I will not be including any installments that are based on previous installments, like any books or remakes of a certain installment, unless the story has a specific alteration from the original one that has an exact contradiction, meaning that it would not take place as the same thing. Because if I did include like all of the remakes and all of the books based on a certain timeline, it would just be a billion timeline splits that all merge right after that same thing takes place, and it's pretty much the same thing anyway. So in including one installment, I also include the rest of the remakes and books and other installments that are based off of that same one. So also, I'm not going to be really going in depth in all the explanations. I do have a separate timeline in my website that goes over just the canon games, and there is a description over each game that tells you like what really took place, and that goes a little bit more in depth, since I'm only going to be going in depth on the non-canon games in order to explain why they are in the places that I put them. So I recommend an accurate knowledge of the Zelda timeline before going into this. Maybe watch someone else's video or check out that canon timeline that I have linked on my website in the description. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, we get just the era of the world's creation, in which the three goddesses create the world and the Triforce, and then we get the Skyward Sword manga by Heimwaka. So you may be thinking that this is based off of Skyward Sword, right? And technically it is, but it actually serves as a prequel. Unlike all of the other books that Heimwaka made, this one actually takes place before Skyward Sword rather than at the same time as the installment that it's based on, which means it has a different story. And actually, if you have played Skyward Sword, then you'll know that this is actually the story that it talks about as the old legend of the battle between Hylia and Demise, meaning that the hero of the skies in Skyward Sword isn't actually the very first Link to exist, but it's actually this one in this original manga right here. So this is the era of the goddess Hylia in which this all takes place, but then halfway through Skyward Sword, we then get the Sky era, and then there's no era for a little bit after that. And then we get the era of Chaos and Prosperity, which the era of Chaos is around the time of the Hero of Man, which is the one referenced as a legend at the beginning of the Minish Cap. However, so far there has still been no games that actually portray him. But then we go into the era of Prosperity and the Force era, in which we get the Minish Cap as well as then Four Swords. So this is when Link is dealing with Vati, and then he seals him in the Four Sword. However, you can see there's a timeline merging right here that brings us Cadence of Hyrule, and so this is a merging with the Zelda timeline and the Crypt of the Necrodancer timeline. But the main villain of this, Octavo, is actually theorized to be the son of Vati due to his similarities in appearance, possessions, and motives. So this takes place right after Four Swords. We can see it merges into the Necrodancer games. We can see them right here as well. This is the era of the Necrodancer, and then they merge down into Cadence of Hyrule from Four Swords. So then we come into this, we get a empty era for a little while, and then this is Ocarina of Time, but it's the Nintendo Power version, which does slightly take place at the beginning of Ocarina of Time. However, it does also serve as a prequel. The first 2 or 3 volumes of it take place beforehand, when Link is only a baby, instead of when he is 9 years old at the beginning of the Ocarina of Time. So then this begins around halfway in here. This begins the era of the Hero of Time that continues on through Ocarina of Time, and then this is when we get the timeline split of whether Link is defeated or whether he is successful. So let's first go on to the hero is successful timeline, and we'll get to the hero is defeated timeline last. So then if he is successful, there's the child timeline and the adult timeline, in which Zelda sends him back in time to relive his childhood, but then the adult timeline takes place in the present, in which Link has left. So that brings us the era without a hero. And then the Wind Waker, which begins the era of the Great Sea. So once again, there's this book, The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, Link's 4 Nautical Logbook. So this is based off of the Wind Waker, but none of the story elements are actually any of the same. This just includes multiple stories throughout the book that just take place throughout the game that were not portrayed within the game, and the main events of the game do not take place within the book. They do take place during the same time, and this one is based off of the other one. The events portrayed are all different. And then we get Navi Tracker, the alternate game mode from Four Swords Adventures, and then Tingle's Balloon Fight. Then this takes place during the era of the Great Voyage, as well as The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass, which ends that era and begins the era of Hyrule's Rebirth with Spirit Tracks, but then it ends to get us the 2 other Tingle games, freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land and ripened Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love in the era of the Great Deku Tree. So this concludes this timeline. As we can see, it begins to merge into another timeline, which I will get to in a minute. However, we're going to come back up here and go over the child timeline now. So at the beginning of this, as soon as Link is sent back in time, we get The Legend of Zelda The Missing Link, in which he is searching for his fairy companion Navi. And then right after that, this is when Skull Kid steals Majora's Mask and the Ocarina of Time from Link, which is what takes place at the end of this game. So then we can see this is the era of the Hero of Time, and it ends with Majora's Mask. And then moving on, we get Twilight Princess beginning the Twilight era, as well as it continuing with Link's crossbow training, and then it ending and beginning the Shadow era with The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures, and then finally concluding the timeline with Hyrule Warriors, which takes place within the War era. So now the thing is, the Definitive Edition game actually does merge in a few different timelines, but at the end of the game, all of them are brought back to their own timelines. You may have seen MatPat's theory about how Hyrule Warriors actually begins the merging that takes place within Breath of the Wild. However, at the end of Hyrule Warriors, everything is set back to normal, so the merging is undone, meaning that it cannot take place in the merged timeline with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and it has to take place within the child timeline. So then with that concluding with the child timeline, we now go on to the hero is defeated timeline, which includes actually a few more splits down the line that I will get to later. It begins with No Era and the Imprisoning War, and then A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. But during the time of Link's Awakening, we get another unknown hero who travels to Hyrule in ancient stone tablets, while Link is off on Koholint Island, or off just sailing and dreaming about Koholint Island in the era of Light and Dark. And then we get Legend of Zelda Oath of Riruto, in which Link then begins to train this unknown hero from ancient stone tablets, who is revealed to be named Riruto in this whole story right here. And then moving on, we get Oracle of Seasons and Ages, which ends the era of Light and Dark and begins the Golden Era with A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes. So this is when we get another timeline split, which is whether the hero arrives late or whether he arrives early. And if he arrives early, it greatly simplifies his journey in the original Legend of Zelda game and makes it much easier for him, which later changes the entire story afterwards. So first, we're going to go on the hero arrives late timeline, because in the hero arrives early, that timeline mostly includes just all of the non-canon installments that take place within the Fallen timeline. However, there are a few that we'll get to in this one as well. So we first just get to The Legend of Zelda, and then once again get another timeline of whether he is actually successful or if he is defeated. So now if he is defeated, another unknown hero arrives in order to take his place and defeats Ganon for him, since he failed to do so, which obviously begins the era of the unknown hero, and it is later ended with The Legend of Hero of Hyrule. Then going Going on to if the hero is successful, this timeline first begins with Battle of Mirage Castle, which is known to be set 3 years after the events of the original Legend of Zelda, whereas the Adventure of Link actually takes place 6 years after, meaning that this takes place in between the two of those games, and then in between the two of these two games, we get the Game & Watch version of Zelda, in which once again the story is actually changed so that Ganon is never the main antagonist and it's actually 8 dragons, I believe, that Link has to defeat. So then all of this takes place within the era of decline, including all 4 of these installments throughout here, and then once again at the end of the Adventure of Link we get another timeline split of whether he is successful or if he is defeated. So if he is defeated, we get the Legend of the Dark Triforce, in which Ganon actually is revived using the blood of Link. However, he is able to later escape and then must defeat Ganon afterwards. And then counterattack from the darkness takes place if he is successful, actually with a future Link and Zelda, not the same ones, who are actually sent back in time to the time of the Adventure of Link and must defeat Ganon, who went back in time and revived himself in that one. So then the two of these both end and then merge down into here, as well as this one back here also merging into here. So we only have a little bit left on the hero arrives early timeline. We first get the Game & Watch version of The Legend of Zelda, where the story is once again changed, and I think that Ganon does not actually appear in it, correct me if I'm wrong. However, I believe that the main antagonist is actually just the dragon Aquamentus. And then we get the Moldblin's Magic Spear book, which takes place at the same time as the Game & Watch game. And then we get the animated series of The Legend of Zelda, and then the Legend of Zelda comic series, which these do include separate links, so these take place in different times. However, they all take place in the same era, which is the Age of Darkness. So then these comics, as we can see, since Zelda has red hair, is able to use this bow and has this same blue, purple, and pink outfit, this begins the CDI series with the CDI games, as well as the 2 books that are based off of it. So first we get the Crystal Trap, and then the Shadow Prince, and then the 3 CDI games, Link the Faces of Evil, Zelda the Wand of Gamelin, and then finally Zelda's Adventure, which ends the era of darkness and begins the Age of Lightness. And with that finally ending, we get all of them, all of these timelines. If we zoom out here, we can see all of these at the very end of them merge down into the Breath of the Wild timeline, which we're first going to go over the era of the Zonai, taking place actually 10,000 years before the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which then ends with the imprisoning war and brings us the millennias of peace, which finally end with the Great Calamity, which starts the era of the Burning Fields. So in the Great Calamity, Ganon takes over all of the divine beasts and uses them to fight the Kingdom of Hyrule in order to take it over. And in this continuity, he is successful in defeating most everyone, but then is later sealed away by Zelda for 100 years, which brings forth the events of Breath of the Wild, in which Link awakens after these 100 years in the Shrine of Resurrection after being mortally wounded by Calamity Ganon. However, during the time of the Great Calamity, there's a miniature guardian that Zelda actually built, and he is actually able to time travel and go back in time, bringing back some of Hyrule's greatest fighters called the Champions, whom Ganon had previously killed. So when he brings them back, they are actually able to then defeat Ganon altogether, which brings us Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, in which the heroes are successful, and this is the saved timeline. But in the timeline that this miniature guardian named Terraco leaves from, he leaves this timeline in order to go back in time and create this new timeline, but this is the timeline that he abandoned, in which the heroes are actually not successful in defeating Calamity Ganon, which brings us Breath of the Wild, and then finally Tears of the Kingdom in the era of the Wild, which begins Tears of the Kingdom with the upheaval. So then this finally ends the timeline and ends today's video. If you did enjoy today's video, make sure to drop a like down below and subscribe with the notifications bell on so that you can be notified of all of my future videos as soon as they come out. And with all that said, I'll see you guys in the next one.